opportunity to interview you briefly. Shaun Gallagher, thank you very much for joining us in Cagliari for the conference on metaphor and epistemic injustice and mental illness. We've known about your work for several decades now, and you've been very active and influential in proposing Fourier accounts of mind, embodied, inactive approaches to mind. So I guess the first question would be, what is the connection, very briefly, between epistemic injustice, or as I see from the program, hermeneutic injustice, and the inactive approach to mind? Is there any, or what is your view of hermeneutic injustice?
Yeah, well, I think we can start thinking about the connection here in terms of tool use, for example, or the use of technology. And what I'm going to try to say is that oftentimes we are pulled into the use of a certain technology when we're not quite sure not only how it works, but what it does to us. And in terms of sort of an active, embodied approaches, the idea is that we engage with the world and we act oftentimes using tools and technologies. But the question of whether we fully understand how these things work and what they do to us is an important one. So I tie that to, well, the use of certain technologies in the area of, in a therapeutic context, when we're using something like a chatbot to do a kind of therapy. And then the question is, how is that piece of technology designed? And the question is whether, say, the patient really understands that. So it's that kind of, it's about hermeneutic transparency and the idea that if in fact that technology is somewhat opaque to us, then there's the possibility of a type of hermeneutic injustice with regard to the patient.
Okay, that's very interesting. And if I can jump to a different realm, because I'm interested in all sorts of issues in the philosophy of art. Would you, and I also see that you've been sort of recently starting to work in the philosophy of art as well, or in aesthetics generally. And I immediately thought of the connection between patients mentally ill, or for lack of a better word, mentally ill patients experience their world, and the kind of, on the one hand, experiences that some artists are said to be having of sort of mental illness themselves, sort of in the way that helps creativity, and at the same time, the sort of help that maybe art can give to mentally ill patients. I thought this might be a good I don't know if you've thought about it, but it might be in this context that an active approach might help out, because it kind of maybe in the process of creation, the process of creation is maybe very inactive, and that might help or sort of give an advantage to these artists.
Yeah, so I think in terms of therapeutic approaches, I'm very pluralistic in the way I think about that. And in the area of aesthetics, I've been focused on the performing arts. So things like dance, music, acting. And I think all of those, dancing, music, performance, acting, can be turned into therapeutic tools. And in that way, we're talking not just about like a talking cure or medicating the brain, but rather a more embodied and active approach to therapeutic practice. So to me, that brings the full person into it, not only in a fully embodied way, but also very much in a social way, because performance is a kind of social act, and it's often performed with others. So if you have embodiment and social context, then I think that really is something like an active approach to therapeutic practice.
And another question that that I've always been interested in, kind of moving on from the sort of psychiatric or mental illness approach. Why do you think, being that, you know, since we are sort of embodied creatures, right, and a lot of what we do therefore cannot but be influenced by the operation of our body. Why do you think? I mean, I know this is a huge question, but what is, do you think, the most influential thought behind so many cognitive scientists, so many indeed philosophers of mind, sort of disregarding the importance of the body and obviously of its connection to action and sensory modalities? What is it that makes them ignore or sort of neglect that aspect?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Somehow I think the body is a bit too messy. It's not easily measured, and in contrast to something like a computational model that one can use, and think of the brain as a computer and the mind as software. That whole cognitivist approach that characterized early cognitive science. It just seems much more manageable. We can study this, we can create models, we can use mathematics in those models, and it seems to allow us to make a great deal of progress. Whereas the body and its relationship to the environment, that might be involved, but it's really difficult to study and to fine-tune your analysis with that. So I think of someone like Herbert Simon, who was very much into the computational internalist conception of the mind, who, with his notion of bounded rationality, introduced the idea that, well, the environment might have something to do with it, might introduce a kind of uncertainty into our considerations. Yet he fully resisted the idea that the embodied relationship to the environment is sort of the important thing. So even in that case, it's difficult to see why opening up to the environment that didn't sort of lead him in the direction of embodied cognition.
And maybe, I imagine, it makes me think of recent advances in AI and generative artificial intelligence. In a sense, that might be seen as further increasing the tendency of philosophers of thinking that the body is not important, because look, there's machines and they can speak like us, and of course, that seems like to me like a naive way to see what these machines are doing.
Yeah.
But in a sense, that seems to be going further away from the body, or do you have a different understanding of what's going on there?
Well, I've been working with a few roboticists, so the idea is, well, look, we can make artificial intelligence more embodied by putting it into a robot, and now we can design a robot. Can we build into the robot as many of our human characteristics as possible to make that robot seem more like a human and to do things like as humans do them, so that they can interact with humans in an easier way. But I think, of course, I think there are some limitations on that. And actually, just last month, Rodney Brooks, a very well-known roboticist, published a really nice article talking about the limitations of robotic design, specifically for the hand and the sense of touch. indicating that the large databases that we use to train the language models or to train computer vision just don't exist for touch. So that the importance of the hand for cognition, emphasized by the enactivists and going all the way back to Anaxagoras, that seems to be not something we're going to be able to build into the robotic design, and that's going to limit the kind of intelligence. It won't be a human kind of intelligence that we get in the robot.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Shaun Gallagher,
Thank you.
thanks again for being in Cagliari.
Yeah, thank you.